This video is sponsored by Private Internet Access VPN. This is not Gaza or Israel. This is the aftermath of forced eviction in China. Mind you, China is not at war, yet for the past 20 years, rural areas and urban alike have looked like this. Tens of millions of people have been forcefully evicted from their homes and shelters. What kind of world is it that when you go to the store to buy groceries and then come back to your house and it's gone? Or when you go to bed at night, you're kidnapped by thugs and your house is bulldozed? Well, apparently that's how China's real estate rise happened. Today I want to tell you how it's done. Since the 1990s, China has resorted to forced evictions to remove people from their homes so that they can demolish it and build new apartment complexes and skyscrapers. This has happened to both rural and urban land in China. And today, the concept of forced evictions has decreased but not gone. Well, because there's too many buildings now, not enough land. So it's time to demolish those new buildings, which they can't seem to occupy completely. But for the last 2 decades, it has become a specialty in China. Just like tofu dreg buildings, it seems like the flavor of forced eviction has taken the worst of the worst in human behaviors, backed by a government, and taken shape in China. In 2015, the fate of a villager who was burned to death when goons threw petrol bombs into his home. Officials say that he lit himself on fire, and it caused a national outcry. In 2019, a Taiwanese businessman lost 20 years of hard work and investment of about 2.2 million US dollars in the western province of Xinjiang after the regime forcefully demolished his factory without any warning. And after struggling for 4 years to obtain compensation, Beijing's answer was simply that he had illegally exploited the land. Now, there are countless stories about this. The basic idea is that the government-backed demolition team, they will come in and evict a family from their homes. Now, the idea of forced eviction isn't unique to China. It's the process by which it is done that angers many people, and it's been doing it for so long. Now, the entire process is, of course, backed by the government's political interests. Now, first, the plan to gentrify the area is told to the people, so they send in representatives to try to work out a deal with the residents to move. Except that deal is shockingly bad. For example, one resident may be offered 200,000 yuan as relocation fees. While it may sound like that's a lot of money, or at least decent amount to buy a new home, it purely depends on where that said offer was given. If it was in a remote area, 200,000 yuan would be enough to buy many homes. But if that same offer was given in a major city, like Beijing or in Shanghai, that's not enough at all. So it creates a situation where residents either don't want to move or aren't incentivized to move, or simply because they want to be paid more so that they can afford another home. And so many hold out. Now, in some instances, the local government directly works with private developers to speed up this process to seize land from villagers so that they can turn it around into complexes, which, by the way, many of them turn out to be ghost city buildings. Well, compensation, as I said, may often be below market price. In some cases, they're offered housing instead. Leave your current one, we'll build you a new home, and you can come live in it once it is done. Now, the catch is if that building is completed. And so that's the problem, right? The government favors developers because, that's how local governments can make their money in China. The governments will lease different land leases to developers for 30 years, and then so that's how they make the money. The developers pay for that land. So the more land that the government sells, the more money they have. And developers like Evergrande, they use that to their advantage to take out more loans, to build more houses, and it's a giant Ponzi scheme. I've done videos on this, so I'll link it here. But in the end, many of these promised buildings do not end up being completed, and essentially it screws the people over. Forced evictions are particularly common in rural areas, and some of them are the major source of the unrest and protest in China. Now, the negotiations between the representatives and the people can go back and forth, and some of them work out a good deal, but most often it doesn't. And the Chinese government isn't eager to wait for these people to come to their senses, so they usually send in a forced eviction team, sometimes consisting of gang members or police and security people. They come with bulldozers and are told to essentially remove the building. In some cases, people are still inside. And many cases, we've actually seen people take up defense of their buildings or their homes with the likes of firecrackers and fireworks, homemade grenades, and various different weapons. And these brave people defending their homes, as well as those that are holding out, are referred to as nail households. They're truly the nail in the eyes of the CCP, enough to hurt the regime by simply wanting the rights to their property. Of course, it always ends badly for the residents. Reports of beatings are common, as well as accounts of people left with nowhere to live but tents and shacks. That's especially hard on the elderly population. Some of them have died while defending their homes. Others have gone to jail. and people protest, they're arrested. And this also just doesn't happen with private buildings. It also happens with temples and mosques and worship places. Now, the latest protest in China took place over a planned demolition of an Islamic place of worship. On May 30th, 2023, many Hui Muslims, which is China's largest Islamic minority in Yunnan province, they come to find out that parts of their mosque has to be removed, the dome and the minarets, and so there was a protest over this. And in the province of Sichuan, a Tibetan Buddhist temple was demolished. And the question is, does the CCP really need to do this? For those temples and mosques, it's a crackdown on places of worship and religious freedom in China. But for the houses, it's purely political. Before we go on to talk more, let me introduce you to the sponsor of today's video. Now, scammers and hackers can easily get access to your information, like phone numbers and emails. That's why one of the best tools to defend yourself online is a trusted VPN. Our sponsor, Private Internet Access, is the world's most transparent VPN provider. Whenever you're browsing online on an unprotected device, such as your phone, computer, tablet, console, etc., your device is transmitting a great amount of information out into the open, which can be viewed by various different entities before it even reaches the intended website. Now, a virtual private network, or VPN for short, hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through secure access channels. Imagine a shield that protects you from those who are looking to harm your online presence. Now, they don't keep a record of your data, which has been proven multiple times in court and by a third-party audit from Deloitte. And the best part is that you can use your private internet access subscription to protect an unlimited number of devices at the same time. And my favorite feature is the built-in ad blocking. Private internet access also allows you to choose one of the 84 countries so that you can access Netflix and other streaming services content in those countries. With this powerful geolocation feature, I use it to browse Chinese websites that are crucial for my research as if I'm in China. By using my link, you can grab an 83% discount on private internet access. That's just $2.03 a month. And you can also get 4 extra months completely for free. So click the link in the description or comment and start your secured internet browsing today. Now let's continue. China's real estate rise and those fancy buildings are built on people's suffering. And China's version of national rejuvenation and people's happiness is apparently forced eviction to take people's homes away. Now, there's more than enough apartments or buildings in China to house its entire population. That's why we're seeing the phenomenons of ghost cities and planned demolitions. Too many buildings, not enough people to live in them. But in the early days, like the 2000s and 2001, many of the Beijing urban areas had to be remade from the ground up to be transformed into the capital as presentable for the 2008 Summer Olympics. Now, could people have lived fine in their old homes and, the CCP just let it be the way that it was in Beijing back then? Definitely. But because the goal here isn't really about putting people into better homes or for the betterment of the people, it's gentrification for the sake of the government's face image and its objectives, right? We know that the Olympics is a big opportunity for the CCP to show off how prosperous China is, and so they took every chance to put makeup on their faces for this particular event. And so how has the CCP been allowed to do this? Well, in China, land ownership is not private. You don't own any land. The government does. The Chinese Communist Party does. They own all the land in the country because that's what Mao did. So that means even if you bought the property and the house, you don't actually own that property or the land, so that they can send in people to take it out of you. And unlike China, in other countries like the United States, and there's constitutional amendments to protect private ownership, as long as it is reasonably on the grounds that, say, for example, you don't want to move or that the land is not in violation of something, it's technically yours, as long as you pay the proper tax. So even as communities and neighborhoods go through gentrification, you can still see these single homes holding out. One of the most famous cases is the Edith Macefield home in Seattle. Ms. Macefield turned down an offer of $1 million to sell her home, which was to make ways for the commercial development in the area. Although later, of course, the house was sold after she died a few years later. But haters are going to be like, well, David, this happens in Australia, in the UK, and the United States as well. I know. This happens everywhere. It's forced eviction is not a unique thing to China, but that happens on a singular basis across the world. In China, it's systemic. It's a problem. There's been a steady increase since 2005 in the number of land takings or compulsory state acquisitions. It's about 43% of the villages surveyed in one particular poll that have been subjected to such land takings. from the decade of 2000 to 2010. And the mean compensation for the local government paid to the farmers was approximately $17,850 per acre. So consider this, when it was resold by the local authorities, mostly to commercial property developers, the mean price was increased to $740,000 per acre. That's a markup of 1,814%, 1,814% in value. And so, of course, we know that there's no such thing as private ownership in a communist state, but Xi Jinping talks about the China model, right? What's the prominence of that related to this property taking? Well, China's economy is said to be state capitalism when it went through the reform era, especially during the 1980s and 90s. Now, in a normal market economy, if the government wants to be a judge or the referee, it's not going to be a player in the economy. But in the CCP's version of the economy, not only will the government judge and essentially make rules, it wants to also be a market player. It wants to be the biggest market player and the rule-making market player. So forced demolition is essentially the government's enforcement of its own interest and at the same time destroying social orders under the disguise of, interest for the entire economy. It's really not. A government instead should be maintaining the rules and the social order, but the CCP is doing that to destroy it. This was very prominent during the development, like I said, for the 2008 Summer Olympics. Many of the neighborhoods were forced to transform, whether they liked it or not. And then later on, there were another wave of forced eviction, but let's talk about something else too. From 1995 to 2005, there was an average of 87,000 people evicted annually in connection to the Three Gorges Dam. So that's a total estimate to be about 1.4 million people. Now, recalcitrant residents in the city of Chongqing had their water and electricity turned off in order to force them to move. And the residents said that they had not yet left yet because, proper resettlement hasn't been arranged. And then eventually at one point, it just kind of all goes kaboom. Now, Shanghai, look at this picture, within the span of 20 years, went from this to this. And part of it is because the CCP can do whatever it wants to do and no rights are needed. Now, you might be asking, why wouldn't anyone want to get a newer building instead of living in their old village homes? Well, other than the bad compensation part, which we talked about, another big reason is that people were just simply scared of what the Chinese government will do with anything related to land. Now, a home to us is like a safe haven, right? You go home and you get a rest. Even birds have nests. It's a human instinct to defend one's own home or nest. It's ironic given that socialism always talks about freedom from oppression and exploitation, yet what the heck is forced eviction in China then? So the land reforms in the 1950s, or land reforms in the 1950s, and the subsequent political movements under Mao Zedong, they essentially established a long-term fear for many Chinese people, particularly those that are from the 50s and 60s. They lived through a period where the CCP could do anything to cause them to starve, lose their livelihoods, and so on. And so that's why in China, there's a huge craze over food security and saving money. It stems from the fear that something big could happen. Now, officials who ordered it are often motivated by greed and a desire to impress their superiors. Local governments have a financial incentive to destroy rural housing. And China's land sales make up a big portion of the local profit. The share of the land sales revenue in total local government revenue increased from 20% in 2012, which is about 2.7 trillion yuan, to about 30% in 2021. And that's according to the Peterson Institute. So powerless villagers, they're becoming victims not because they choose to be, but because there's no other options. Many of the times, like I said, the idea of trying to go to a new place isn't really what they want in mind because they know that what they're getting in the end must not be as good as what they currently have because they've lived through it. Millions of them have essentially been turfed out of their homes. And the new housing is often cramped, no more than the spacious courtyards that they have grown up with or their family have. And so some of the villagers, even though they're living in a quote-unquote terrible condition prior to being moved, it was enjoyable. It was a living. It was a lifestyle. And so being forcefully evicted, mind you, is forbidden under the UN International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Right? China has actually ratified that. But this does not clearly define the term forced eviction, and China isn't really known for abiding by international laws. And so with all that being said, this is all being done under illegal jurisdictions, but at the same time legal in the sense that the CCP can really do whatever they want. Even under the Chinese constitution on other property like laws and such, the resumption of urban land by the state is permitted only for the purpose of supporting the public interest, and those being evicted are supposed to receive compensation, resettlement, or protection of the living conditions. But again, the definition of public interest here is really ill-defined. China's leader Xi Jinping and his predecessors, like Premier Wen Jiabao, they've long insisted that the rural revival must not involve mass demolition and mass building. But in 2011, China's legislative body had to implement a new law limiting the use of violence in forced evictions, as well as outlawing the clearing of property at night and during holidays. And so, under all sorts of different changes, it indicates to us that violent forced evictions were still happening, continues to happen today, and despite not as big in scale, it's still something that they do. And so, while they say that forced evictions should only be used in emergencies, the terms are not defined well enough to categorize what the heck is an emergency. And so, none of the laws are really enforced on this, and laws in China are always selectively applicable. And that's basically how they're able to, for the last 20 years or so, do this to millions of people in China. All right, that's it today for the episode on forced evictions and why it's contributing to the rise of China's real estate. If you enjoy the content, leave a like, comment below your thoughts on this topic, and subscribe to our channel. As always, thank you so much for watching. See you until next time.